So I've put a short presentation together, which I've titled Mediumship and Survival, an Alternative Narrative. It's a presentation that I've had the pleasure of presenting at numerous conferences, lectures and workshops over the years. It was a presentation I put together, as I said, several years ago, with the aim of providing those individuals who are interested in mediumship or interested in understanding more about the survival of human consciousness, and to provide them with, in many ways, a more of a balanced narrative as to what the scientific literature says about these topics. And really it was designed to try and counter some of the mainstream medium scientific community push to try and portray mediumship and survival as some type of weird thinking or wishful thinking or some sort of abnormal thinking. And as we'll see in the forthcoming slides, this is a very sensible and rational area of research and a very sensible and rational belief to have. And let's go through some of these slides. So, as I was saying, it's quite apparent to me, and perhaps yourselves who are listening and watching here, that there seem to be large sections of society that are reluctant to want to think for themselves and prefer to outsource their thinking to others who are more than willing to think on their behalf. The problem is, in doing so, those who are doing the thinking for them will, as a tendency, only give them the information that they think is deemed necessary. So, for example, I'm sure many of you have seen over the last few years any academic or researcher that dares to speak out or tries to put forward an alternative perspective, other than that designated by some fact, by some quango of scientists, are frequently censored by the mainstream media, and with scientific journals refusing to publish their studies and research papers. If at the worst, most often than not, the media will try to ridicule, or the scientists or the scientific community will try to ridicule anyone trying to speak out for the mainstream ideas or thinking. It's even been known within the field of parapsychology for authors to be chastised by editors of mainstream journals for even daring to consider sending them a study describing their paranormal findings for consideration. It's also been known for skeptical pressure groups to influence journal editors who may have inadvertently published a paper in their journal on a topic of paranormal to have then find a reason to withdraw the paper. In all, academics and scientists who attempt to promote their work supporting the paranormal beliefs suggest there is something genuinely interesting, something genuinely worthy of research, or even dare to consider paranormal investigations will encounter some form of censorship in some form. Of course, that's not to say, because there is literature that does support, for example, communication with the deceased. But nevertheless, for me, I think there should be a balance, and science should endeavour, I believe, to provide a holistic picture of all the fields of research. As such, as I explained earlier, the point of this presentation is to provide you with a quick summary of the information to try and balance the narrative. So, let's first start by looking at the consensus being promoted as possible explanations as to why people believe in the paranormal. So here we're going to go through a number of slides that talk about perspectives, worldviews, or how people perceive the world. And one of the views here is the worldview hypothesis, and the interpretation of paranormal beliefs as a product of wholly contemplative and reflective exercise, endorsed by other internal truths. as he says here, internal truths. The skeptics take this to mean that believers of the paranormal tend to hold beliefs ungrounded in reality, referring to an inner feelings and perspective. So this is what they refer to as the worldview hypothesis. And in contrast, people with an objective materialist worldview are inclined apparently to deny or take no interest in things that are not physically observable. Another perspective why they say people hold paranormal beliefs is because there's some type of psychodynamic need, what they call the psychodynamic hypothesis. And here they say the beliefs are held because they serve some significant psychodynamic need within the individual. Skeptics take this to mean that believers, let's put that here, that believers of the paranormal are some way psychologically deviant or dysfunctional, and the belief correlates to the personality of the believer. So in other words, there's something that's gone on. Being psychodynamic probably suggesting there's something that's gone on in this adult's childhood, provoked some type of trauma in some cases. Maybe they've had a passing when there was a child, and so believing in the paranormal, believing in the afterlife, is some way soothes that trauma within them. The other view that's often talked about is that the people who have paranormal beliefs are said to be rather illogical, irrational, uncritical, and even foolish. The hypothesis suggests that believers of the paranormal are to have some sort of supposed cognitive deficits with memory abilities, intelligence, and imagination, with poor education in science or other specialist skills, for example, critical thinking. This is the one that really strikes me as the one that the mainstream media likes to promote more, in the sense that, if you believe in the paranormal, you must just be stupid. If you believe in the paranormal, you can't have the ability to critically think for yourself. You have memory sort of deficits. You have intelligence deficits. Only the stupid, I'm sure we've all heard it. Only the stupid could possibly believe that we survive after physical death. Only the people with very low IQ could possibly have that. When you understand science, they say, when you have a scientific background, when you have a critical thinking background, then all these types of beliefs will just fade away. Well, as you'll see, it's not as simple as that. So, according to a lot of these hypotheses, the alleged scientific consensus would have us view a paranormal believer as likely to be irrational, uneducated, and using some sort of paranormal belief to fulfill some type of trauma, a psychological need, perhaps the need to be accepted in some group, and perhaps likely to have some type of memory and cognitive deficits. Now, is it not really any surprise that we want to keep, if you do hold such views, you are interested in the paranormal, you are interested in survival or mediumship, it's no real surprise really that these people tend to keep that belief to themselves if the mainstream perspective is that to have such belief you must be stupid, you have some sort of psychological need, you have some sort of uneducated, irrational thinking. All of these sort of negative imagery, negative imagery cannot be healthy in trying to move forward this idea or move forward this research topic of survival. But as we will see, thankfully there are some very courageous researchers out there who are willing to challenge this and have produced some very interesting research. But as I said, this won't necessarily stop desperate people trying to promote such myths as fact. So the literature has become so overwhelming in not supporting these hypotheses that perhaps in a panic, the likes, for example, of Michael Shermer, who's I don't know if he still is, but was at one point the director of the Skeptic Society, wrote in an article in the Scientific American in 2002 trying to explain why even smart people believe in weird things. So, as I said, there is this idea that that the people who believe in the paranormal have some sort of cognitive deficit, have a particular worldview that is not based in rational science. But as I said, there are those in the scientific community, courageous scientists, researchers in the community who are doing research with mediums to find very interesting things out, who are doing research in looking at the personality traits, the personality profile of those who believe in survival, believe in the paranormal, and it's contradicting. It's contradicting a lot of the things that the mainstream scientists would have you believe. So here, what we have is Michael Shermer, who is very much a skeptic of all things paranormal, trying to explain, well, okay, so we have some scientists who are researching it, so that doesn't actually fit the model now, that there's some sort of cognitive deficit. So there has to be another reason why these scientists are spending their, in many cases, I suppose, wasting their time, they would say, in researching this field. So as I said, so apparently it's not only the uneducated with those lack of cognitive skills such as critical thinking that believe in the paranormal, it's smart people too. So in this article, it's rather interesting, but Michael Shermer doesn't provide any detailed explanations, but rather argues that the reason smart people believe in the paranormal is because they've not had enough scientific training. In other words, regardless of your cognition, your educational background, your professional background, you could be a professor in psychology, a professor in neuroscience, which incidentally I know some of who are researching in this field. You can be a professor in all these very successful sort of career in academia, and be a prolific publisher of research papers. But if you believe in the paranormal, let's go back, sorry. If you believe in the paranormal, then that's because you still haven't got enough critical thinking. Well, that just seems a bit ridiculous to me. So let's have a look then at some of the evidence supporting life after death communication and survival, which some in the scientific community would prefer you didn't know. So let's have a look at mediumship first of all. So life after death survival as a research topic normally encompasses a couple of subtopics, and what you have here is we have what's called deathbed visitations. Here are near-death kind of deathbed visitations, is essentially where those who are terminally ill often will see loved ones who have passed before them come and talk to them, and you may experience, if you've got relatives who have passed at some point, of them talking of seeing people who have passed before them, saying they're coming to visit them, or they've said, I've heard a friend whose mother passed, and the friend said to me that they went around to see their mother, and she was talking about seeing her husband who'd passed before, several years before them, and saying, you should have been here sooner, your dad was here, you could have had a chat with him, that type of thing. So it's where people who have passed before them come back and be beside those who are soon to pass into the spirit world. We've also got near-death experiences, which are experiences that many people have had, as it quite involving, where perhaps the heart rate has stopped, the brain activity has stopped, and yet they're still having some sort of coherent experience, which somehow, due to medical intervention, they're able to come back from death or near death back to the living, if you like, and be able to recall these experiences that they're having. But in particular, what we're going to talk about here is the side of mediumship, and in particular the evidence given by mediums to suggest some form of survival. So mediumship, as it says here, for those who may not be aware, mediumship is an ability of an individual known as a medium to regularly communicate with deceased personalities. So a common myth promoted by some in the scientific community, as we've kind of alluded to in the previous slides, is that what mediums are actually experiencing are bouts of psychosis, or as I said, we discussed, experiences with cognition and other type of mental pathologies. But again, we don't hear much about studies that contradict this perception. For example, we have a study published in 2022 looking at the cortical health, or the health of trance mediums, spiritualist trance mediums. Now, just for clarification here, when we talk about trance, sometimes we hear about channeling. From this perspective, we're talking about spiritualist trance. So the difference here is that when we talk about spiritualist trance, we're talking about communicating with personalities, or human personalities, people that have lived here and who've now deceased, and coming back through the medium to communicate. Whereas it's slightly different from channeling, which encompasses communication or intelligence from a whole vast array of intelligences. So, aliens, the spirit world, angels, guardian angels, all sorts of things. Now, when we talk about spiritualist trance, we're talking about personalities, human personalities. Channeling is talking about other forms of intelligence, or a broader spectrum of intelligences. But here they tested a whole host of trance mediums and for their cognitive ability, and they found quite clearly that the cognitive functioning of subjects who practiced trance mediumship in Brazil was associated with a good form of cognitive health. So no cognitive deficits seen here. Likewise, in Northampton University, a research published by Dr. Rockborough and Professor Chris Rowe did a survey with a whole host of mediums. I think it was 59 mediums, 159 spiritualists, it says there, 80 mediums and 79 non-mediums, and their findings suggested that mediumship is not associated with a pathology of dissociative experiences or anything like that, but rather mediums seem to enjoy a good level of mental well-being when compared to non-mediums. So in this study, they used a whole host of surveys to measure sort of mental health well-being, and what we found was the mediums really sort of like enjoyed a higher level of mental well-being compared to non-mediums. But nevertheless, much of our knowledge comes from journalists and other media sources such as newspapers, and of course what gets reported is often taken by many. Remember what I was saying earlier, we like to sort of like offload our thinking to others. So the media is often one source, so what gets reported is often taken by many as being the truth. I've lost count a number of times. I've reminded family and friends to take a more questioning perspective of the accounts being reported by tabloids and other media sources. But of course, the same is true in the way that psychics and mediums are reported by journalists, with accounts often written with sweeping generalizations and uninformed statements masquerading as the truth, with mediums often referred to as fake, frauds, charlatans. Again, such labelling is reminiscent of techniques used by organisations to deter you from exploring the reality of survival, and likewise to deter you from investigating and thinking for yourself. An important message there. Here's an example. Here. This was published in a journal, the Office, unfortunately titled The Office of Science and Society, Separating Sense from Nonsense. And here was an article, quite a small article, written by I think it was their science editor, so we say. And here it was talking about I think it was a Netflix show consisting of a medium. So there's a well-known medium that has a Netflix series, and they wrote this about them. As a skeptic, well, instantly that says a lot. As a skeptic, I feel it's important to first confront the central claim made by this show, that this medium can get impressions from the dead. There's no good evidence that the dead can talk to us. What can play the role of mediumship, however, are two techniques called cold reading and hot reading, and while the former can appear banal when described, it can be very convincing in the right hands, especially if the sitter, whom the medium reads, very important there, is vulnerable and misremembers the detail of the sessions. There are so many generalizations in this. First of all, it basically says there's no good evidence the dead can talk to us. Well, as we will see later, there is an abundance of good evidence that the dead talks to us. What can play the role of mediumship are two techniques called cold reading and hot reading. I'll discuss those later. And it says that it will be very convincing in the right hand, especially if the sitter, who the medium reads, if this individual who wrote this really understood what mediumship was about, they would know that mediums spend a lot of time developing their sensitivity in ways to ensure they're not unconsciously reading the body language of the sitter, and it says the sitter is obviously vulnerable, which is true, which is why there's been an abundance of literature out there about interviewing mediums, about the way that they work in terms of their code of conduct, in terms of ethics, that shows that an abundance of mediums, especially those mediums who hold awards or accreditations with some spiritualist organizations, all fall within some type of code of conduct, all have to work with some type of ethical background. Because we know, the mediums know that there is, the person that comes to them is often bereaved and is vulnerable. So it's very important they have this code of conduct. And misremembers the details of the session. So here, they're talking here of things such as witness testimony and such like where, as we'll see, and Barnum statements and Fourier effects, which we'll talk about. But it's just a generalized reading that shows literally a knee-jerk reaction to the fact that there's this Netflix series with this very popular medium, and it just showed absolutely no consideration, in fact, no critical thinking on their part to be able to write a balanced report here. So let's have a look at cold readings and hot readings. This is cold readings, for example. These are often used as explanations for mediumistic and psychic sittings and so forth. But so cold readings are essentially, as it says, they're Barnum effect things. So what they are, cold readings are basically generalizations. So as a person would say such a thing as, well, if a medium saw, if a sitter came who was in their 60s or 70s, so we say like that, came to see a medium, then the medium most likely would be right if they said you have a mother in the spirit world. And just by knowing a little bit about society, culture, the era of the person, you can start pick up little bits and pieces about some generalized statements that seem to fit, but would incidentally fit with a wide range of people, a wide range of sort of situations. So they're the sort of what's called Barnum effect there. We're using generalizations, typical things like, your mother's telling me in the past you've had problems with your back. Well, the majority of people have had problems with their back in the past. So there are these types of statements here. And also involve things such as reading a bit of the body language. You know, if the person comes in well dressed and so forth, then maybe they are, you know, they maybe come from a quite a well-to-do family, and maybe you can pull some sort of clues from that to make out, to pretend, you know, that you're connecting with some type of individual, some sort of family member, some sort of loved one from the spirit world. The trouble with a lot of these explanations is that researchers who work with mediums know about these techniques as well, and so when they work with mediums, they put controls in place to ensure that the mediums aren't using these techniques. The other one is hot reading. I don't know if I talk about that on the next slide. No, okay. So very quickly, if I talk about this one, hot readings. So cold readings are generalized statements, general statements. Hot readings are where it is alleged that the medium has researched prior to meeting the sitter the information about the sitter. So, you know, maybe they've gone on social media, maybe they've gone, you know, like Facebook or whatever. Maybe they've gone through the newspapers and found the obituary column of a loved one or whatever. And so basically, they've basically done some research beforehand. But again, you know, as I said, the researchers who do detailed, high-class research with mediums, who publish their papers in peer-reviewed journals, know about this. You know, they do all sorts of studies with these mediums where they are controlling for cold readings, controlling for hot readings. You know, example here, a research conducted by the Windbridge Research Centre. I think the name's changed slightly now, but it's the Windbridge Research Centre. You know, really sort of like pioneered in many ways some of the triple blind and double blind protocols used to ensure there's no what we call sensory leakage. There's no way that the medium could guess or understand or get some sort of sensory leakage from the recipient. Because in many cases, you know, when they do the studies, you know, the mediums are in one room, the sitters, you know, are in another room, and they don't meet each other. And very often, you know, there are two researchers, and the researchers don't know who the mediums are or who the sitters are, and who the sitter, you know, which medium is working with which sitter. You know, it's totally blind. It's only when we put all the paperwork together, the sittings are transcribed and scored by the sitter, that they're actually sort of like, you can actually see who did which sittings go with which mediums and which sittings go with which sitters. So it's the only way you can do that. But nevertheless, when you do the research, time and time again, you find that the research is conducted and the findings show that there is something of interest here. For example, in this one here, it says here, because the experimental conditions of this study eliminated normal sensory sources for information, mediums report a non-local, however controversial, remains the most likely explanation for the specificity of their statements. So here we've got an example of a controlled study under blinded conditions, it says there, where the mediums were able to get information about deceased people that the recipients could understand, and they couldn't explain it. They controlled for all the condition, all the sort of hot reading, cold reading conditions, but they were still able to get information that the recipients could understand. Another example here, we have a meta-analysis. Now, a meta-analysis are regarded by many as the gold standard. For example, in the UK, we have the National Institute of Clinical Excellence, which basically defines the sort of the cascade of medical sort of interventions that doctors and health professionals can actually administer to patients depending on their presenting conditions. And And so a meta-analysis is regarded by many as a gold standard. And so, but here we have a similar sort of thing of a meta-analysis being done to decide what the overall evidence is. So in this particular case, there was this meta-analysis was conducted, and what they did was they looked at all the peer-reviewed papers published between 2001 and 2019. All the papers on mediumship, what they call their anonymous information reception, they call it, but it's actually talking about communication with the deceased. And really just to understand, look, if we look at all the papers, all the research out there in that between 2001 and 2019, bring it all together as one big body, and let's have a look and see what does it generally say. What's the overwhelming picture that it presents? And as I said, the conclusions of this, the results of this meta-analysis support the hypothesis that some mediums can retrieve information about deceased persons through unknown means. We can go further. There's another study conducted. This one was published in 2021. And here they did a similar sort of thing. Again, got a group of mediums together. They
controlled for all the sensory leakage, so we know the mediums didn't know who the sitters were, the sitters didn't know who the mediums were, the researchers didn't know who the mediums was doing the sittings for, and who the sitters. It's like, anyway, it's all triple-blinded protocol, controlling for all these types of sensory leakage. And here, actually went a step further on it way here. If you look at this study provides further evidence that some mediums are able to obtain accurate information about deceased people, knowing only the deceased name and with no interaction with the sitters. It also supports a hypothesis that in some cases the sources of the information are the deceased themselves. So here the researchers have gone a little bit further. In the previous studies, they were saying that they were getting information, but we don't know where we're getting it from. But obviously, these mediums are getting information about the deceased from somewhere, but we've controlled for all the normal sources, and we don't know where they're getting it from. In this study, they've actually gone a step further and said, look, let's look at this. And when we look at this, we can see that actually, in some cases, the only explanation where the information can come from are the deceased themselves. So I contacted the authors of this study to ask them why they felt the deceased could be the source of information. And they pointed out that they controlled for all the physical explanation and only leaves there for non-physical explanations, and from their perspective, the most likely being the information was coming from the deceased. And so they felt quite justified at providing that conclusion to their paper. But again, this has been published in a peer-reviewed journal, something you don't often hear of, I'm sure. So we can see there's good quality evidence suggesting that mediums are able to get information from non-local sources, including the deceased. But skeptics will still say, oh, come on, perhaps the mediums believe they're communicating with the deceased, but isn't it really just an overactive imagination? Well, interestingly, researchers also thought of this as well, and they also conducted a study. And what they did was they got a group of mediums together, wired them up to an EEG, the brain, to measure the brain activity, and asked them to do it at some simple tasks, and essentially compared between an imagination task, essentially, and the task of mediumship. Can you connect with someone in the spirit world and provide some evidence? And when they looked at the brain activity, when they found significant differences between the two brain activities of someone doing an imagination task and the mediums doing the mediumship task. In other words, there was no similarity in the electrocortical activity seen when the mediums were communicating with the deceased compared to when they were imagining or when they were fantasizing. There was this other task they were making. Can you just imagine something, just fantasize something? So it clearly seemed to demonstrate
the mediums aren't just imagining. It's not just a fanciful imagination that they believe, because the brain activity shows there's clear differences between when the mediums were imagining something and when the mediums were working with the spirit world or connecting or communicating in some way with a deceased personality. And in fact, in this paper, I think in this paper here, they actually went further. Here we go, and basically suggests that the impression of communicating with the deceased may be actually a distinct mental state that's distinct from other ordinary states such as thinking or imagination. So again, it shows that mediums, are not pathological. Don't have fanciful thinking. It's not because of some sort of personality trait. It isn't because of their imagination. No, there is something real going on here. So from a personal perspective now, I've done some research with mediums myself, and I'm going to show you some very simple studies that I've done in particular with trance mediums. And again, if you remember when I said trance mediums, these are spiritualist trance mediums. So when they go into this altered state, they are able to allegedly communicate with a discarnate personality, so a human personality, not some other form of intelligence. So I'm interested in what goes on in the medium's brain whilst they're communicating with the deceased in particular. So as I said, I started to develop in spiritualist trance, and I wanted to see what's going on in the medium's brain when they were in this trance state, this spiritualist trance state. So as an independent researcher, I did this research. It says there, I pointed out here, I did present the findings of this research in the Society for Psychical Research, the 43rd annual conference back in 2019. And I just used something off the shelf, a commercial EEG headband called the Muse. It's been used in other research with meditators, Buddhist monks and so forth. It's quite good at measuring what goes on at the frontal part of the brain. This is where we have our focus, our executive control functions and things like that. So it's quite an interesting area to look at. And I used a software you can download onto your iPhone or a mobile device called OptiBrain that provides nice sort of topology sort of pictures of what's going on, and it measures sort of the level of activity at the certain points that the probe, the headband, actually measures. Okay, but it shows the activity as blue with being very low activity to red being a lot of activity at that area. So in this sort of image here, you can see the top left there, which is at the left part of the frontal part of the brain. There's very little activity. There's on the other side, on the right side of the frontal part, there's a little bit more activity, but not a lot. And the rest of the parts of the brain, the two sides in particular, there's just sort of like an average level of activity based on that scale. And we're not going to go into detail as to what that actually means, but what we're going to do here is I just want to show you some of the imagery I captured, just to show you something that I thought looked quite interesting. So so what we did here, we got a few mediums in. They did what they do. I gave them an opportunity to go into their altered state, to commune with the spirit world, allow in spiritualist trance, obviously, they allow the communicator to come through and speak through them, allegedly, one would say, but come through them. And I just measured the activity of what's going on in the brain. And what I did was I measured the activity as soon as they started speaking. As soon as it is alleged that communicator, that discarnate personality, was going to come and speak through them, that's when I started to capture the data to see what was going on. So this is an example of two mediums at rest. Okay, medium 1, M1, and medium 2, M2. And what we got here, you can see very different activity here, and this is the mediums before they go into their mediumistic trance state. This is just capturing their brain as they're at rest, not doing anything. A lot of activity, a lot of red activity on M1 seems to suggest that this person was kind of stressed. There's a stress response there, there's kind of emotional response there. And on M2, you can see there's a lot less red, there's a bit blue there, a bit green there. So this medium M2 was a bit more chilled, a bit more relaxed with what was going to happen. So they did their demonstrating. Okay, so again, I allowed them just to quietly do their thing, to go into their trance state to see what happened, and we captured this activity as soon as they started communicating. This is the activity that we got there. So you can see there is a difference, a shift here with more activity on the right side than on the left side. Okay, now there's a lot of talk about the right side being more the creative, inspirational side, and the left side being more rational and analytical. And there's some elements of truth for that, but there is a lot of overlap between the functions and structures as well. So it's not as clear and definite as that. But what we're seeing here, as I said, is a shift from that very stressful position where both sides were very red, so now what's happened is just the right side, a lot of activity on the right side, suggesting something interesting on the right side of the brain is going on when they're demonstrating. But what I thought was really interesting was medium 2 showed pretty much exactly the same level of activity. And here what we see here is, remember in medium 2 they were quite chilled, quite relaxed. Here we're seeing again similar type of activity going on. So it seems to suggest, even in this sort of these samples, shall we just say, that there is something clearly of interest at the right hemisphere of the brain related to trance mediumship. We also did a demonstration. We also got them to do some mediumship demonstrations, some mental mediumship, the sort of things you might see in a church service or what have you. And so this is one particular medium. I've got it's similar results across the whole board of mediums I've used, I've measured, I've worked with, and what we see here is a sense of we see the mediumship demonstration, a bit of activity on the right side, higher activity again on the left, higher activity than the left, I should say, excuse me, on there. You can see the start is obviously as they start the demonstration. The middle is the part of the demonstration where they're actually in full flow, if you like, of the communication. So again, you can see the activity seems to be suggesting there's something going on the right side of the brain here. And then the end is when the medium starts to wrap up the communication. Okay, and when you see the end, you can see it's sort of like returns back to the sort of condition it was at the start, which I thought was quite fascinating. So you're seeing again, whether it's trance mediumship or a mediumship demonstration as one would see in a church demonstration or in a centre, there's something interesting going on with the right side of the brain here, the right activity there. This is just one I just added in here just for interest, and this relates to spirit controlled art demonstration. So here, instead of conveying a message, speaking, I'm aware of this, I'm aware of a mother in the spirit world, she was such and such. And this particular medium had the ability to draw portraits, but they would go into the deep altered state to draw the portrait. And it's very fascinating to see this medium work, because they sit there with a board, with a piece of paper on the board, clipped to the board, and two pencils in their hand, and they put the pencils on the piece of paper, and they close their eyes, and you can see them just drifting into a very deep altered state. And then all of a sudden, with their eyes closed, deep in this altered state, their hands are moving around, and they're drawing this wonderful portrait which we find later on someone who was in the room could understand to be a loved one of theirs that has passed on to the spirit world. But anyway, so let's have a look at the brain activity of this medium, this trance, this spirit artist, the spirit controlled artist. So when they started, very little activity, quite calm, relaxed. What was really interesting was, soon as they started drawing and we captured an image, we found there was no activity. The system didn't record any activity during the whole period of them drawing. Now, I'm thinking to myself, well, this must be a technical issue, a problem with the headband, because obviously, no activity, no brain activity means, you're pretty much dead, which is not what we want in an experiment situation here. And you can see that no activity, you've got the zeros here. No, it's not measuring any activity at all. But what was interesting was, as soon as they put the pencils down at the end, after they'd finished the portrait, still in the altered state, still with their eyes closed, the activity just burst back into life again. So this is one of these anomalies. We can't explain what happened here. We probably would never be able to replicate this, but it was just a fascinating thing to see. A couple of books that I would recommend you getting if you are interested in mediumship and you are interested in the topic of survival of human consciousness. These are very good books. They give you a very balanced perspective of what the literature says. The Science of Life After Death on this side, there is a chapter that talks about the prejudice, if you like, let's call it that, the prejudice that a lot of the researchers experience trying to get their papers published in journals, because the journal editors just will not accept anything that has anything relating to the paranormal to it, because they feel it'll add sort of discredit their journal overall. Which is a shame, because there's an awful lot of good literature out there that perhaps just hasn't made the publication. We don't get to see it. But anyway, that's what I wanted to share with you. So in this presentation, I've attempted to demonstrate that what we've been told about survival and mediumship is not the full picture. That contrary to sweeping generalizations and often the ridicule that we get, when we analyze the body of survival evidence through mediumship with a rational, rigorous and open mind, it's ridiculous to deny the conclusion that the survival of human consciousness after physical death is a fact of nature. In my opinion, it is an obvious fact when you look at the literature. And you look enough at the literature in a balanced way. In fact, survival in most cases, in my opinion, is the most natural explanation for the phenomena of mediumship. Unfortunately, I'm not going to go into detail as to why organisers such as the media and the mainstream scientific community would rather you didn't know that we survive physical death. But the reasons are numerous, and perhaps I should put some slides together and have that conversation and discuss that with you at some point in the future. So that's a quick summary of some of the literature out there discussing survival, discussing mediumship, that shows you quite clearly that mediumship is something of interest. That's survival of human consciousness, rather than just being a belief only held by those that are stupid or who have very low IQs, is actually a very serious topic with many researchers and scientists around the world taking this topic seriously. And so please continue to research yourself. There are wonderful organisations. You've got the Parapsychological Association in the US. You've got the Society for Psychical Research in the UK, and most of the European countries have their equivalent. So do feel free to have a look around and join. You can join just as a member,
Join us just as an interested person, and you get all sorts of interesting literature and access to interesting papers that show you that if you believe in mediumship or believe that we survive physical death, you're not alone. There are many people out there that believe and know the same.